All right, so ready to dive into a story. It's one that's captivating, definitely complex. Imagine a man so principled, so righteous, he'd rather, face execution than betray his beliefs.
Yet at the same time, this same man, he's hailed as a saint, but also he's accused of ruthlessly persecuting anyone who challenged his worldview.
Yeah, it's wild. Sir Thomas More is just fascinating, even centuries after, well, after his death.
Yeah, he embodies these contradictions. His time period was immense religious and political upheaval.
Exactly. And to really get this enigma, I think we have to explore how three different films tackle Moore's legacy. The classic A Man for All Seasons, and then the Tudors, a little bit more contemporary, and then recently, kind of controversial, Wolf Hall.
Yeah, and each film, each one offers a distinct lens. A
Hmm.
Man for All Seasons presents him as a man of unwavering conscience, a hero who sacrifices everything.
Yeah, that film definitely paints a very sympathetic portrait.
Yeah.
But you mentioned other interpretations, so what kind of more do we see in the Tudors?
The Tudors takes a more nuanced approach. It acknowledges both Moore's brilliance and his flaws.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, we see his wit, his charm, but also, his ruthlessness, especially dealing with those he saw as heretics.
So we start to see the cracks in this, well, saintly image. And how does Wolf Hall portray Moore?
Wolf Hall, it goes even further. It presents him as rather unsympathetic, a man driven by ambition and this rigid adherence to dogma. He's more of a villain than a hero in this one.
Wow. Talk about contrasting viewpoints. It
Yeah.
makes you wonder how much of each portrayal is, rooted in historical fact and how much is creative license.
Right. And that's a crucial question. What's fascinating is even during his lifetime, there were already, conflicting narratives about him. His supporters, mainly family and fellow Catholics, they painted him as pious and virtuous.
Right.
And then Protestant writers like John Fox in his Book of Martyrs, they depicted More as a cruel oppressor.
So even back then, history was being written from different perspectives.
Exactly. And these films, they're essentially drawing on those interpretations, not just facts.
Right. Okay. Let's unpack these interpretations on screen. Maybe we could start with Moore's personality. So in A Man for All Seasons, he's witty, eloquent, almost, well, saintly.
Mm.
How does that compare with the historical evidence?
Well, More, he was undoubtedly intelligent, devout, but also known for his sharp tongue and his harsh treatment of those that challenged his beliefs.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. In his writings, he didn't shy away from, colorful language to attack his opponents, called Martin Luther a pimp and an ass.
Wow. Okay. That's certainly a far cry from the eloquent Moore in A Man for All Seasons.
Hmm.
It really highlights the choices filmmakers make in shaping a narrative.
Absolutely. They pick and choose what to emphasize, often for dramatic effect.
Right.
Interestingly, The Tudors has been criticized for historical inaccuracies, but it actually portrays Moore's execution more faithfully.
Hmm. You mentioned that the Tudors offers a more balanced perspective earlier. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. A Man for All Seasons focuses, almost exclusively on Moore's perspective, presents him as a solitary hero. The Tudors explores the relationships, the power dynamics within Henry VIII's court.
Ah, so we see more not just as an individual, but as a player in a larger game.
Precisely. We see his interactions with other key figures like Cromwell, Anne Boleyn, and of course, Henry VIII himself.
Right.
This allows for a more, well, nuanced portrayal showing his positive qualities and his more ruthless side.
This brings up something I was wondering about. Was more truly involved in the persecution, the torture of heretics.
That's a complex issue. While there's no, direct evidence linking More to torture, he passionately defended the persecution of heretics in his writings.
So while we may never know the full extent of his involvement, it's clear he wasn't opposed to it.
Exactly, and this is where Wolf Hall takes a dark turn. It depicts More as actively participating in these brutal acts.
So each film reflects a different facet of his personality, or at least how he's been perceived.
Yeah, it's a reminder that there's rarely a single truth when it comes to historical figures. They're often as multifaceted as the times they lived in.
Right, which makes it all the more interesting. Now, one of the, I think, most compelling aspects of Moore's story is his mastery of language. A Man for All Seasons really highlights that wit and eloquence. The dialogue feels almost Shakespearean.
Yeah, Robert Bolt, the screenwriter, he was a gifted playwright. He drew heavily on the more idealized accounts of Moore, especially from his family and supporters. But as we discussed, the real Moore wasn't always so polished.
So A Man for All Seasons, while it showcases his rhetorical skill, it maybe presents a romanticized version of it. How do the Tudors and Wolf Hall handle Moore's way with words.
The Tudors, although being more visual, still depicts More as a skilled orator, capable of charming and intimidating. There's a scene where he schools Henry VIII on a point of Latin, leaves the king impressed and a little emasculated.
Knowing Henry VIII, I can't imagine he took that too well.
Probably not. But it shows Moore's intellectual prowess. It was undeniable.
Right. And this ties into another key element of his story. His silence. His refusal to swear the oath, acknowledging Henry as supreme head of the church. It sealed his fate. A man for all seasons presents this silence as powerful. Defiance, a way to stay true to his conscience.
It's a fascinating legal strategy rooted in equivocation. It means using ambiguous language to avoid revealing one's true beliefs. More, he believed that by staying silent, he could avoid endorsing or condemning the king's actions.
But surely that was a risky gamble, considering Henry VIII's temperament.
Incredibly risky, and one that ultimately failed. Henry, determined to break Moore's resistance, created an act of parliament to trap him.
So he was trying to protect himself by being silent, but Henry changes the rule to make sure he gets taken down.
Exactly. The act declared that anyone refusing to swear the oath was guilty, maliciously denying the king's supremacy. It was blatant, a power play, the lengths Henry would go to, eliminate opposition.
It puts into perspective the pressure Moore must have been under. But did all three films interpret this silence the same way?
Interestingly, no. Wolf Hall, while portraying Moore much less favorably, it suggests that his downfall, it wasn't just his silence, it was a careless slip of the tongue during a conversation with Richard Rich.
Ah, Richard Rich, the man who later gained notoriety for his role in the persecution of Anne Askew. Wasn't he a key figure in Moore's trial?
Absolutely both. A Man for All Seasons and Wolf Hall depict Rich as ambitious and morally flexible, willing to do whatever it takes.
So despite their very different portrayals of Moore, both films seem to agree on Rich's unsavory character.
Yeah, it speaks to the enduring power of certain historical narratives. Rich's betrayal of Moore, it resonates as a symbol of moral corruption.
Okay, so we've talked about Moore's personality, his language, his calculated silence. Let's get into his trial. What were the charges against him?
The primary charge, as we've said, was treason, based on the accusation that his silence meant he agreed to the act of supremacy. But there were two other charges. One alleged collusion with Bishop John Fisher, who was another critic of the king, and the other stemmed from that supposed conversation with Richard Rich, where Moore, he supposedly made incriminating statements about the king's authority.
So it sounds like they were set on building a case against him, regardless of any real evidence. Did they actually present any proof to back up these charges?
That's a key point. A Man for All Seasons argues that Moore's trial was a sham, orchestrated by the king to eliminate a threat. It emphasizes the lack of solid evidence and points to Rich's perjured testimony as the reason for Moore's conviction.
So it's basically a classic example of politics and manipulation of the legal system to silence dissent.
Exactly. And the Tudors, it doesn't go as deep into the legal stuff, but it depicts Henry systematically targeting anyone who opposed him. This casts Moore's fate less as defiance, and more as part of this campaign, to crush resistance.
Moore becomes this symbol of the struggle against tyranny in the Tudors. It's interesting how these films use history to explore these bigger themes of power, justice, conscience.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's Wolf Hall, which takes a different approach. It acknowledges the politics behind the trial, but suggests Moore's downfall was partly his own arrogance and his underestimation of Richard Rich.
Wolf Hall is saying he's partly responsible for his fate.
In a way, yes. It portrays Moore as so convinced of his righteousness, so blinded by his principles that he didn't see the danger from Rich's ambition.
So that complicates the man of conscience narrative. If his downfall was partially his pride or misjudgment, does that make him less sympathetic?
It's a good question. It reminds us that historical figures are rarely simple heroes or villains. They're complex, admirable, and flawed.
Right. It challenges us to avoid simple interpretations.
Exactly. Now we've talked about Moore's personality, his trial, his use of language, but we haven't talked much about his philosophical side, his famous work, Utopia. Did any of the films capture that?
It seems hard to put those philosophical ideas on screen. Did A Man for All Seasons, with its brilliant dialogue, did it go into the ideas in Utopia?
Not really, no. The focus is mainly on his moral dilemma, his struggle to maintain his integrity.
So it shows he's a brilliant thinker, but doesn't really explore his ideas. What about the Tudors and Wolf Hall?
Well, neither film really talks about utopia directly, but they offer glimpses into More's intellectual world. Like, there's a scene in The Tudors where More's books, they're taken from him before his execution. You can feel his grief.
It's a reminder that he's more than just a political figure. He was a scholar, a writer.
Yeah, that part of him often gets lost.
So we've covered a lot. More's personality, his language, his trial, even his philosophical side. But the question is, how should we remember Sir Thomas More? With such different portrayals, is it even possible to understand him?
That's the question, and I don't think there's an easy answer. Each film gives us a perspective.
It's like trying to put together a puzzle with some pieces missing. You get the picture, but there are gaps, questions.
Exactly, and that's history. It makes us deal with ambiguity, with the complexity of human nature.
So where does that leave us with More? Hero, villain, martyr, zealot. Is it even possible to categorize him?
He's parts of all those, and yet he's more than them. He's an enigma, a man whose legacy continues to spark debate.
Right. We shouldn't try to force historical figures into categories. They were real people with contradictions.
Absolutely. As we conclude this part, think about what parts of More's story resonated with you, what felt most compelling, truthful, and how does his story, with all its complexities, how does it speak to our own time?
It's a fascinating thought. It shows how important it is to really engage with history. Stay with us as we keep going with More, his legacy, and what his story tells us about ourselves, our values, and power. So welcome back to our deep dive into Sir Thomas More. We've looked at his personality, his trial, even some of his philosophical work. Now, the big question, what's his legacy?
It's a question that people are still debating. He inspires reverence and condemnation.
Yeah, exactly. We've seen 3 interpretations in film. The hero in A Man for All Seasons, the balance figure in The Tudors, and then the villain in Wolf Hall. How do we even reconcile those? Is it possible?
I think first we have to acknowledge that More's legacy it's inherently contested. To some, he's a Catholic saint, a martyr, stood strong in his faith, even facing execution. But to others, he represents intolerance, the brutal suppression of different views.
So it's back to that tension, man of conscience versus religious zealot. Can we bridge those two sides, or do we just have to live with that contradiction?
It's a question historians have struggled with for ages. And I think that's why his story keeps fascinating us. It makes us confront uncomfortable truths about history, about faith, about human nature.
Prepping for this, I was struck by how relevant More's story feels today. Even 500 years later, we're still dealing with those same things. Conscience, freedom of belief, the limits of state power.
Absolutely, yeah. Think about our debates today. Free speech, censorship, the role of government, echoes of More's dilemmas.
It's like his story it's a mirror reflecting our anxieties, our uncertainties. But how should we approach this legacy? Can we admire his principles but also acknowledge the darker parts of his actions?
We have to avoid simple interpretations. I mean,
Right.
More was a product of his time, shaped by the 16th century. We can't just judge him by today's standards.
Right, context matters. We need to understand his world to get the choices he made.
Yeah, and that's where the films, even with their differences, can be helpful. They give us a glimpse into that world, and maybe we understand our own world better because of it.
It's a reminder that history isn't just facts. It's human stories with their triumphs and their tragedies, all their, complexity.
Exactly. And More's story, it shows us humans are capable of great things, but also terrible things. He had convictions, strong ones, but sometimes those led him to actions that, well, today we'd find troubling.
It's a sobering thought. It should make us approach history and each other with more humility.
Couldn't agree more.
Okay, so as we wrap up our deep dive into Thomas More, what are the key takeaways here? What do we learn from this guy?
Well, I'd say one thing is the power of his story. It still sparks debate. It makes us think. It challenges what we think we know. He can't be easily categorized, and that's part of what makes him so interesting.
And maybe his story, it reminds us to think carefully, to avoid judging too quickly, to see the complexity in people.
Mm-hmm.
History, like life, is rarely black and white. Lots of gray areas.
Well said.
And with that, we come to the end of our deep dive into Sir Thomas More. I hope this has, made you curious, maybe challenged your views, and gotten you thinking about history and human nature.
And as always, we want to hear your thoughts. What do you think about Thomas More, about his legacy, what it all means to you? Share on social media. Let's keep the conversation going.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep diving deep.